Hey, hi everyone, and welcome to today's Animals and Society Colloquium. My name is Carol Glasser, and I'm on the council for the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association. Us, along with the Animals and Society Institute, put on this colloquium series. During the academic year, we have about one colloquium a month. If any of you are ever interested in participating, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to hear your ideas, and we'd love to get you a spot. The Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association is primarily for sociologists who are members of the American Sociological Association Society. If you are a sociologist, I encourage you to join. But most of you probably are interested in what we're doing, but even if you're not a sociologist, so we do have a newsletter and a listserv that you can join, and I'll pop that information up in the chat. All of you, everyone in this audience, should be following ASI, Animals and Society Institute. They're doing a lot of great work with academia and animals, and they have a newsletter that's completely free. You can also become a member of the organization, but I highly encourage you to sign up for their newsletter. And we also keep all these past colloquiums online. So I'm going to post in the chat a bunch of links to all the things I just mentioned. So if you're interested in any of those things, please follow those links. But listening to me is not the reason that you're here today. You're here for today's talk. So let me get to that. Today's talk is called In the Innocence Bubble, How Non-Human Animals Companions Intersect with Childhood Innocence Within U.S. Mixed Species Families. Our speakers are Yana Kucherko, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Brooklyn College and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the Graduate Center at CUNY. We also have Antonella Guadagnino, a graduate student who is in the Department of Psychology at the CUNY Graduate Center. So with that, I will hand it over to our speakers today to present In the Innocence Bubble.
Great, thank you so much. We are thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for coming and for the invitation. Everyone is seeing the, okay, awesome. So we'll get started. So we are really interested in the topic of how animals are interacting with children's everyday lives. And first, I want to acknowledge that Antonella and I are here today talking about the work, but really it takes a village of many wonderful humans who help make this possible. So I just want to acknowledge Juliet, Michaela, Sarah, and Rosanna, many of whom are here, who really help do this work with us. And there's much part of it as we are here when we're talking. And I also just want to acknowledge Erica Niwa, who's a professor in our department at CUNY and who's a co-PI on this project. And I want to thanks to Carol Glasser for inviting us and for joining this project as well. And she's provided really amazing feedback. And so it takes a village and acknowledgement is due. And so we're here because we're really interested in how children interact with animals. So we know from this emergent body of work that multi-species families is a particular type of family that has emerged in line with diversification of American family systems and structures and family structures. And so in these multi-species families, animals are very commonly constructed as significant others, right? They're called siblings, they're called children, they're called partners. And in concert with humans, they really can transform family structures into distinct types of families with very unique needs. And we also know that children across the globe grow up with animals, whether they're reared in multi-species families or whether there's a different kind of relationship they have to animals. Animals are often the first death that children experience. They develop really meaningful, important relationships with animals. And so these relationships are lasting, they're intimate, and they're important, and they're under-recognized often when we think about socialization of young children. And so we're really interested in this relationship between animals and childhood. But specifically, we're interested in a particular aspect of childhood experience, and that's childhood innocence. So childhood as a phase of life is socially constructed. It varies across history, across context. An aspect of constructions of childhood, one is that children are demarcated from adults. In a way that they're considered less developed, they're on the way to becoming full adults, their unique needs, and children are often, especially in Western contexts, but not only, are construed as innocent, as naive, as in need of protection and shielding. And childhood as a time of life is constructed as a time when children can play, be curious, and have some kind of inoculation from the adult, harsh realities. And because children are construed as innocent, naive, vulnerable, and in need of protection in many societies, especially in the US, they are often relegated to particular spaces and discourses when they can kind of be playful and curious and so forth. And what that means, that's done through parents and other adults who kind of regulate how children move through spaces. And what that means is often there's a kind of segregation with very young children, with families who do construct children as very innocent, because it is very racialized, classed, and gendered. There's a lot to say here about child innocence. But generally, children's lives are segregated such that parents will regulate what kind of information, experiences children have access to that they think is for adult eyes only. And those topics include death, sex, violence, and so forth. And so the way that in our project we're thinking about this is that children are, in a way, living in this innocence bubble. It's not a real bubble insofar that it isn't physical, but it's also an apt metaphor for us to understand how regulation of this innocence works, right? Children can see outside the bubble. They don't know that they're in it. It's constructed and regulated by adults. And it seemingly protects them, and it is incredibly easy to burst. When we talk about childhood innocence, we really need to think about it in the context of also intensive parenting and helicopter parenting and all the other practices that enable parents to kind of regulate and shield children, right? And so we know from Viviana Zeltz's work, the changing social value of the child as children exit the labor market, and into schools, they increasingly began to be seen as economically useless and emotionally priceless. And then we have, the past couple of decades as intensive mothering, intensive parenting practices where parents are kind of sculptors of children's experiences. So we see those as going hand in hand, sociological kind of phenomena. And interestingly, there's also emerging work on how dogs are also occupying similar roles in the family as children have, where they are becoming economically useless and emotionally priceless, and attributed to the same sort of, seen through the same kind of economic lens. And so for this project, our bigger aim is to understand how animals are entangled with childhood. And in particular, we're very interested in how animals interact with parents' abilities to regulate children's innocence bubbles when it comes to topics they think are not appropriate for young children, such as sex, death, violence, and so forth. What do animals have to do with the innocence bubble? We think that they are very powerful agents of bubble bursting. They get sick, they have sex, they die, they get violent, they do all the things. And there are many opportunities for children to be around animals, accompany them to the vet, go to the aquarium, and they're exposed to animal actions in ways that we think is bubble bursting. And so animals can very dramatically alter parents' plans, and we're very interested in what parents then do, right, with regulating that bubble, and how do they construct ideas about children, animals, and them together in relation to childhood innocence. So very briefly, in terms of what we've been working on, this project is in progress. We're almost finished. We have 23 parents we spoke with. They're all in the US. We chose the US because parents generally here construct animals as companions and as children for babies, as family members. We're hoping to get about 30 people. They're spread out across the US. About 2/3 of them identify as white. They're mostly middle-class samples. All of them adhere to childhood innocence ideology. And so culturally, that's pretty stable for our sample. And for this portion, we're going to present emergent data analysis for our interview protocol, in which we have one-on-one Zoom interviews with parents, and we ask them a range of questions about their animals. We ask them about the personalities of their animals, what they're like, where they live, how they're integrated into the family. We also ask questions that prompt parents to think about and discuss their conceptions of childhood as a phase of life, and how they construct children as agents that navigate childhood. And much of our analysis comes from stories that parents share with us about past events involving animals and children. And we prompt for those stories by asking them, whether and if they think animals shape the kinds of conversations they have with children, and when was the last time, and what happened. And initially, we sought to interview parents about their non-human animal companions, probably because we discovered this through a different study where we were talking about race and gender, and parents just kept talking about their animals. So we figured this was something really important in understanding social states of children. But as we started interviewing, we realized actually there's a whole very rich ecology of all these different species that interact with children, including ways that wild animals are entangled with childhood innocence. And so we're going to give you really broad examples of all kinds of animals, in addition to dogs and cats, in relation to childhood innocence. And so our process, we transcribe the data, and we're using grounded theory coding to generate the themes. And right now we're looking at a number of themes. We think that they all work together, but I'm going to go one by one to break this down. So first, we look at the context of conversation, and that entails, what happened? What's the event? Is the conversation around, usually it's around death and sickness and suffering, but it's also about sex and violence and the usual suspects of kind of what young children are shielded from. Then we look at parents' relationship to the topic. And this is, how comfortable they feel talking about sickness and death and violence with young children, how comfortable, how much they know about it. A lot of times parents' own professions kind of inform their relationship to these topics. We also look at the animal's relationship to the family. So we code for what kind of animal it is, whether it's a cat, dog, fish, turtle, chicken, where it lives, is it indoor, outdoor, is it considered, food or entertainment, decorations. So in our analyses, we are attuned to the different ways that the species are interacting with their role in the family. We also code for whether parents construct those animals as siblings, friends, or more of a pet owner or cohabitant relationship, to kind of point to the emotional closeness that some animals hold for the family. Then we look at parents' conceptions of childhood, and here we're really looking for how are parents making judgments about what children know, can know, should know, and also what children feel, can feel, and should feel in relation to the topic of the conversation. And finally, we're very interested in how parents regulate children's innocence bubbles, and we look at that in ways that is done verbally, like when parents use euphemisms, or they just say directly what happened, whether they're kind of lying or making up a different story to avoid saying what happened or not telling the child at all. And we'll look at actions, whether they're exposing the child to the event or whether they're shielding the child from the event by not allowing the child to see or experience what happened. So we think that these are very overlapping constructs. And they kind of, the constellation of all of them are unique for every scenario. And so we have 23 families. For the sake of time and also depth, what we'd like to do is present kind of case studies. And what we're presenting today is generalizable to the rest of the sample. But the stories are a really powerful way to kind of explain how these things work together. And we chose these four families to give you a taste of the variety of different animals that are entangled with childhood in our study, and also a variety of different situations. And so we have Sharon, Pamela, Beverly, and Katrina, and you'll see here, a variety of fish, chickens, cats, dogs, and so forth. So I'm going to hand it off to Antonella, who will jump in about the scenarios.
Thank you, Yana. Hi, everybody. So our first scenario was told to me during my interview with Pamela. And just as a quick reminder, Pamela had 2 children. She had a son that at the time of the interview was 3.5 years old, and a daughter who was 7 years old at the time of interview. And she led by telling me this story of goldfish, store-bought goldfish that she keeps in her backyard in a pond. And she described this massacre of the goldfish, and she was trying to navigate how she should deal with this in relationship to her children. So the story went as follows. She was at a store with her husband and her 2 children. And when they came home from the store, the first thing they do is they take their dog outside into the backyard. So they did their normal routine and they went into their backyard. And in her periphery, she noticed that something was unusual about the goldfish. She noticed that they did not swim toward her, which was a typical behavior that they would do because they were the fish. She claims they come to her when for food. So she noticed that no one was swimming toward her. So she looked to her side and she noticed that one of the fish was laying on his side. And so she told her husband, please take the children in as quickly as possible. And so he did. And so she went and she looked underneath the lily pads that were laying on top of the water. And underneath what she saw was about 75 dead goldfish, and only 2 survived. And she did salvage the 2 remaining that survived. But she described the situation as follows to me. She said, to her daughter, I said, I have bad news. I said, some of the fish died. And, we just told her about it. I didn't want my daughter to see the fish. I don't ever want to see an animal die. I don't know if she understood the permanence that they're not going to be here anymore because now we've got new ones. That's scary for a 7-year-old. So right. But at the same time, I don't want to lie to her and say, oh, I don't know what happened to the fish. She's not stupid. You know what I mean? It's a fine line. I can still picture the freaking goldfish dead in the pond. I don't want her to see that. That's bothersome to me. So what we get from this short excerpt, which was taken from my interview with her, if we look at what's highlighted in green, we can see that she's regulating the innocence bubble here. She said, we just told her about it, right? So she's choosing not to show her daughter, but she is telling her daughter what happened. And then her relationship to the topic is demonstrated in when she says, I don't ever want to see an animal die. So that's her own relationship to the topic, right? And then in blue, I don't know if she understood the permanence because now we've got new ones. So she's telling me what her conceptions of her 7-year-old child might be. And then if you look at the yellow at the bottom, she said, the freaking goldfish. And I point this out because this to me signifies the animal's relationship and role in the family. We tend to see this theme that when someone is talking about their dog, they tend to not have this emotional distancing. But with certain animals, they may show this emotional or psychological distancing. So Pamela went on to also tell me about a squirrel that they found in the backyard. And the squirrel was acting unusually, and they noticed that the squirrel was injured. So they decided to take the squirrel in. And she showed her children, her 3-year-old and her 7-year-old. The 7-year-old was more involved. The 3-year-old was just to the side playing with his toys for the most part. But what she did was she noticed that the squirrel was injured. So she involved her 7-year-old daughter in looking up local wildlife sanctuaries and emergency rooms for veterinary care for the squirrel. And this is how she described the story and the outcome of the story to me. She said, the squirrel was a lesson to my daughter. You see something in distress, you help it. I didn't want to upset her. I see something like that. I feel like she doesn't need to know. You're never going to see it again. I don't want to upset her. Really, what's the point? We took care of it. Let her think the thing was okay. You know what I mean? She just said to me the other day, Mom, did you ever find out if that squirrel died? I don't know if I should have done this, but I said, nope, let her think we saved it. I'm teaching her that that's what you do in the future. She would want to help one another, animals and people. You take care of living things, especially things that need help. that she did something good and she helped something, and she saw an animal was in distress and we helped it, and maybe it's okay. So what Pamela is describing here is the situation where she exposed her child to the caretaking of the squirrel, but not the outcome. When she actually did receive the outcome about the squirrel, an email from the sanctuary informing her that the squirrel had unfortunately passed away. Again, when the 7-year-old asked her about it, she told her that she had never heard from them. So you could see a strong regulation of the innocence bubble, right? Where something she's willing to expose her to, and other information she is not willing to expose her to. And she's using this to get a lesson out of it, to incentivize her daughter for future behavior, right? She wants her to repeat taking care of animals and people. Another thing I want to point out about this, if you see highlighted in yellow here, is once again with the squirrel, she referred to the squirrel as the thing. So the animal's relationship to the family. She did not once call her dog a thing. The other story Pamela told me was about how her turtle beheaded a goldfish. So Pamela, the little bit of background is that Pamela was walking in her backyard, and she lives in rural New Jersey. And there was a baby little turtle in the yard, and her daughter, who was 5 years old at the time, said, "Mommy, we can't leave this turtle here. A predator is going to get it." So she allowed her daughter to take the turtle into the home. And what she did was she had a tank, and she built this, artificial little environment, ecosystem, semi-naturalistic, which included fish in the tank with the turtle. So one day when her children were at school, Pamela was home, and she saw that hanging out of the turtle's mouth was a goldfish head. So the goldfish had died. And she explained the story to me this way. She said she's in school one day and he's freaking dead. The fish's head hanging out of his mouth, right? I'm like protecting. She came to the realization herself that if we let him go, he's going to get hurt or killed. So, and we have to take care of him. So, okay, we can keep him. I had to get rid of it. I didn't want her to see that. I had to get rid of that, the evidence. And I had to just tell her about it. I told her, bad news, this is what happened. And so you can see, again, strong regulation of the innocence bubble, where she is willing to tell the daughter, talk to the daughter about what happened. Your fish is no longer in the tank because turtle ate the fish, but she's not willing to show the daughter the consequence of the turtle's behavior, right? She's not willing to show the daughter the consequence of the violence, which is the death. And once again, in yellow, we see highlighted here, she said he's freaking dead. So I think, again, there's some psychological, emotional distancing with the type of animal that had died. Now we move on to Beverly. Beverly has a son who was 4 years old at the time of interview. She has 2 dogs, a turtle, and 2 cats. And she also had a dog who had passed away a year prior to the interview. And she had photos of him all over the house. And her son was 6 years old when 6 months old, I'm sorry, when the dog passed away. And she spoke about the dog a lot with the child, and I was discussing this with her, and she explained it to me as follows. She said, I find it incredibly helpful to teach about death, and that you can still love them, like memories. I mean, my father's passed, so I find that we have to teach him about him the same way. Well, also, keeping the memory, because he was important to me, and it was very important to me for them to meet. For me, the dog. Yeah, for my dog and my son to meet. I don't distinguish between, like a person dying or a dog dying. I mean, someone's still not with us anymore. And so what we see is that Beverly is very comfortable with the context of the conversation. Just a little bit of background. She is an ICU nurse. She deals with death and dying quite often, if that, that might influence her, the way she behaves this way. So she says she finds it incredibly helpful, right, to teach her son about death and expose him to this part of life. And then in gray, you see here her relationship, right? She's letting us into her relationship with the topic, that you can still love them and you can maintain an emotional relationship even though the physical bond is no longer there. And in yellow here, we see it was very important for me for them to meet. And this tells me about the animal's relationship to the family. She did a lot of talking about how this dog, who she had for 15 years, was very much like a son to her. And it was important for her child to meet this dog. And so she still keeps his memory alive by discussing him today. So now we move on to Katrina. And Katrina has about 20 chickens in her backyard. She lives in Montana. She has a dog and 2 cats in the home. And her son was 5 years old at the time of interview. I was asking her questions about her dogs and about her cats. And then we got into death and illness around the chickens. And this is how she explained it to me. She said, one of them got eaten by a coyote. Oh, well, we thankfully did not witness it occur, but it happened. And the dog was barking and I wasn't home. And Kane and Kyle, that's her son and her husband, Kane and Kyle went out to the woods to see and found the pile of feathers and kind of correlated what had happened. Yep, one died. Chickens just die. She was not even old for a chicken. He was there for that. I don't know how much that he's retained or would recall. He didn't see her dying. We have one right now. She's old for a chicken for her breed. She's old. She's 4. She's retaining fluid in her abdomen, and I had to drain fluid from it. I'm not a nurse, and well, this is a thing I'm doing, I guess. And so he would ask about her. He's like, well, I'm going to give, I can't remember what he had, a treat or something, fruit or something. He was like, well, I'm going to only let her have it because she's the one who's sick. Like, oh, that's nice. And so I asked her, did the chicken cross the rainbow bridge? She quickly said, nope, it died. There's no rainbow bridge for chickens. Sorry, chicken. And so if we just focus on that comment for a second here, and we focus on what's yellow, it shows you the animal's relationship to the family. She's not being very delicate about it. She was actually having this conversation with me in front of her son. Chickens just die. They do not cross a rainbow bridge. If we look at the blue highlighted here, I don't know how much he retained or would recall, right? So those are her conceptions of how her child has experienced this and what he's able to know and remember. And then in the gray, she says, we thankfully did not witness it occur. And this was interesting to me because she said we did not witness it occur. She was including herself in that and not just her child. So perhaps her relationship to the topic is that it does give her a little bit of discomfort if she had witnessed the violence. The next story I'm going to actually pass on to Yana. This is still about Katrina.
So Katrina also spoke about her dog and her cat, and she spoke about them quite differently than the chickens. And so we wanted to give you an example of this other scenario in her life as a contrast. And so here she's talking about her cat, current cat, and then her prior cat who had passed. Here's what she said. So he's had some real life experiences referring to her son as a young person of grandparents dying. It's serious because you die, you don't come back. We've talked about that. And also in the context of the pets, my first cat died. Her name was Fergie. I remember him being like, I miss her. And I feel sad. And she's like, all the normal things you would say when a pet dies, gone. And so there were conversations around that. I try to name it without being like horrific or traumatizing. I try to name it to not this totally floozy thing, the rainbow bridge, like this cute and nice, but also equating it to the fact that your pet did die and we don't get to see him again. And that's why it's so hard when something dies, because it just doesn't get to come back and we don't get to give it any more hugs. And there was a lot more conversation around my cats dying and talking with him about that and talking through that than there was with the gray chicken who just died. And so he knows where the vet is. He comes with me to pick up her flea medicine, whatever it is. I've talked to him about that too, in the sense of like my other 2 cats having health conditions and all the things that happened that led up to them. I think specifically with the second one, I was able to say, I'm bringing her to the vet today, and the vet's going to give her medicine to help her die. I don't try to explain the age-appropriate way. It's better for the vet to help her right now. Give her the medicine that then is for her to be alive the way she is, because it was pretty icky. And so I have a lot of conversations with that poor kid. He's probably just like, oh, just leave me alone. And so we see here a number of things. One is that we see the comparison between, and she makes it very explicit, how she's talking about the cats dying with him and processing that with her child, than with the great chicken who just died, who didn't get all this processing. The dogs and cats typically, in her story, do go over the rainbow bridge, which is really interesting. Chickens do not. And the regulation, the regulation of the bubble is, she's trying to be direct without being too gruesome. So there's some conceptions of childhood there around like what she thinks a child can and should handle, and how she's sort of being direct, but burst in the bubble, but not burst in the bubble, right? And I think all the parents are walking that line in really, really fascinating ways. And she does work in a hospice, and she does talk about death a lot. So this is part of, her own relationship to this topic, because she is quite comfortable talking about this and exposing her kid, not only verbally, but also bringing him along to take part and experience cats getting treated and cats passing. And so that's a very big contrast to Pamela, for example, who was really removing the child from the scenarios and maybe telling them sometimes in some ways. And so the final interview we'll talk about involves two scenarios to give you a sense of different types of conversations that came up. So this was Sharon. Sharon has two children, a boy and a girl. The girl is older, she's about 7, and the boy is about 5. And she has 2 dogs, and she also has had 2 goldfish. And so with this scenario, we chose it because although most of the scenarios that kept coming up were around pets dying and animals dying in some way, and sexuality is something that children are very much regulated around when they're very young. And so this came up for her when it came to children being exposed to sex. And so what had happened was that she left the kids with her stepmom, and one of the newer dogs started humping the other one. And then her kids saw this, and so she recalls the story this way. And so the second week of Lulu being here, so week 1, Lulu's the dog. Let's backtrack. Week 1, Jackie was like romantic with her. He was trying to hump her. By week 2, she was already bigger than him, and he was running, and then he would just still try to hump her, and when he got the chance. By the second week she was here, Jackie was still trying to hump her. My stepmom was here babysitting, and she calls me at work, and she's like, I think I just told your kids about sex. And I'm like, what? So my daughter had just said, like, what is he doing to her? So she said, humping her? We can't let her do that. We can't let him do that. And then it was like, what is that? She's trying, he's trying to have sex with her, and when you want to make a baby, and she's just like made it worse and worse. And so thankfully the conversation just ended there. Between my mother and I smoothing it out, she didn't ask a ton of questions. So then I had probed Sharon. I'm like, can you tell me a little more about what your kid was asking about the situation and what you said? And she responded saying, she just asked what the dog was doing and why. And so we just told her, right? So that she understood the behavior. She just doesn't understand why. She just has her own, feelings about that. And so here we see Sharon is not very comfortable with the situation. Her shock to us expresses that she's like, we got to manage this, right? And smooth it out, right? So that the kid gets the questions answered, but we don't have to go into desire and other parts of sexuality that maybe the kid might not be ready for. And so she's also making judgments about what her child, what the feelings that her child has toward that. And so here's another scenario about the fish that's also kind of an example of how animals are entangled with children in the bubble, and also kind of how they become lessons and how they're deeply they pull on cultural traditions of the family. And so in this event, they went to a carnival of sorts, and the kids won a prize, and the prize were 2 goldfish. And when Sharon was talking about this, she was like, oh, worst prize ever. Now I have these 2 fish. What am I going to do with them? And so they brought the fish home, and they didn't live very long. One was for the daughter, one was for the son. And one of the fish died. They had very cute names for them. We have aliases for all the animals and the humans who participate in our study. So here's how she recounted what had happened. So one day we came down, her and I, that's her daughter, and we saw Mac and Cheese, which is an alias for this fish, who also had a very similarly cute name in the same genre of names. So Mac and Cheese was floating. So I said, okay, unfortunately, he went to heaven. He went over the Rainbow Bridge. So my kids go to Catholic school. We pray and we say grace at dinner. So I told my daughter, I said, okay, let's say a prayer and put him in the toilet. And she was like, oh, what? I said, you don't want to do that? That's okay, I'll do it. And she's like, no, I want to do it. I want to say a prayer. And so at first she was kind of like mind blown. And then we did it. We said a prayer, and I said, okay, don't tell Brandon, that's the younger son. Just wait until he notices. Don't say, hey, your fish died and we flushed him down the toilet. She's like, okay, Mom, I won't tell him. As soon as he came downstairs, oh, your fish died. We had to flush him down the toilet. And he's like, what? And he cried, like he felt lost, like, where's my fish? So I don't know if he was so sad about the fish, but hey, you still have the fish and I don't. And that's a tough difference to distinguish. But then Julia, the other fish, didn't make it, and we did the same thing. And she's like, Mom, I want to say the prayer again. And so here we see in the situation with the fish, besides it being a lesson and sort of a way for the family to kind of also practice their saying graces and their eulogies, Sharon is regulating the innocence bubble in this kind of way. She didn't want her younger child to know, right? Her older daughter discovered it, so they had to kind of deal with it. And she's making sort of interpretations of what Brandon could be feeling. Is Brandon feeling left out because his fish died, or is he feeling left out because he didn't get to do the sermon? So here we see how all of them are working together. And so just to wrap up and leave room for conversations and questions. So this is, again, very much a work in progress. This is our first time presenting this work, so we're very, very honored to be here. So our preliminary reflections are, we're finding all these really interesting ways that animals are entangled with children. This is very much a US-based trend, although I think it can speak to other places that have similar attitudes toward animals, or other families that have attitudes toward animals. But we're seeing this as an extension of other work that's done on US families, where childhood innocence is very much endorsed. And also animals are construed as family members, and particular animals specifically. We see that depending on if you're a cat, a dog, or if you're a chicken, or if you're a turtle, or if you're a fish, the treatment they receive and how they are, how the innocence bubble is regulated, very much kind of speaks to the animal type and the animal role in their relationship. And we're very interested in ways that this could possibly, look different in other contexts. And we do have, we've gone through so many months and months of trying to figure out how to code this data. And we settled on, we think that there are these themes, and they're interacting and overlapping in these complex ways. So we're deeply curious about any suggestions you have of what we could expand on, what we're missing, what we're sort of, recap, how we could think about this in other ways. And then we also do have a really big lab of many non-human animal companion researchers. Just wanted to highlight that we love animals, and they're part of they're entangled in our own very research lives. And thank you so much for our information, and I will stop the share.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. Would you mind popping your email addresses into the chat, just in case anyone needs to reach out to you? I would like to open it up now for question and answer for Yana and Antonella. You can go ahead and raise your hand and I can call on you, or you could pop any questions that you might have into the chat. I will get us started with a question. Something that I was interested in was sort of the overlap between the categories. I know that it's still ongoing research, so you might not have perfectly figured out the trends that are going on. But are there any major trends that you've started to notice in terms of when certain categories overlap kind of consistently, or when certain overlapping categories kind of have consistent outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Antonella, do you want to give a shout, or do you want me to try?
Yeah, I do. I noticed, Carol, that the mother's conception, or parent, except that the reason I say mother is because we are typically interviewing mothers, but the mother's conception of the child's ability to know, or what they should know, is very much related to her own comfort with the topic. And they tend to do this even unknowingly, unconsciously. And then as I probe more, they even come to the realization themselves that they're sort of doing that. And then the other overlap would be the comfortability with the topic in relationship to the species or the role of the animal. So if the role of the animal is you are a pseudo child, you are a pseudo sibling, I'm more uncomfortable talking to you about then sex, violence, and death around this animal. However, other animals, like for example, wildlife or an animal on TV that I'm more distant from, both physically and emotionally, I can use that animal as a catalyst, and I'm okay. My comfort with the topic varies based on the role of that animal. Does that answer what you asked?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. And to build on that a little more too, I think the types of animals, so dogs and cats, because they're construed as family members, actually many parents want to then have a more difficult time talking to their kids about what had happened, because I think they're emotionally close to the animal. And what we find quite often is that then, and we saw it with in the memory scenario where she talked a lot of Beverly. She talked a lot about sort of, my dog died, and then similar to my grandfather, like as parents are talking about their dogs dying and their cats dying, they're also in the same sentence often talking about their human family members dying. And so I think that there's something coming up for them that's very interesting.
Thank you. Monica, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed that. And early on, like when you started the very first slide, I was like, uh-oh, this is going to be about animals dying horribly, and I don't want to watch that. And then I realized, I'm like, oh, and do I want to be kept in an innocence bubble? And there's an interesting, I go back and forth on this, right? Because one of the things I've noticed, especially in online spaces, is that sometimes animals hurting other animals is used a lot to justify violence against animals, right? That nature is red in tooth and claw, and if you sentimentalize the animal, then you're that. So this justifies all sorts of human violence against animals because animals are naturally violent. But on the other hand, the reaction that I often have of I'm just going to curate my feed to only be positive stories about animals because I can't handle anything else. And so I wonder how much I agree with you. I definitely think this is fascinating in terms of how we keep children in an innocence bubble. But the larger implications for that as a society of like how we use violence, intraspecies violence with animals, and navigate it. So I don't have a coherent question there, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, oh, it's so interesting, totally. And just also like what comes up too is what you mentioned too, of like how adults also need sometimes a bubble of protective bubble from all the violence that we may be exposed to, right? Yeah, so we've I think I lost my train of thought. Antonella, do you have I'll come back to it.
Okay, you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Monica, what I noticed a lot of is, for example, there was another story where a child actually cracked an egg that he found outside in a nest, right? And so the mother, and so what I did was I started to probe for, well, you're teaching him to be gentle with the remaining eggs and to watch them hatch, right? And not to be violent with these other eggs that are in a nest. And she actually watched the trajectory of the development of those of the birds until they hatched and they flew away from the nest. And I probed for, well, then how do they feel about the egg on their plate and things like that, right? And it seems, Monica, that they're sort of desensitizing the child, like trying to not make the distinction for when humans are violent toward animals. Later on in life, we'll use it to justify what we do. But with the children, what they're doing is they're separating the two things. And I think that what that leads to is desensitization. And I see that trend. It's been repeated. I've seen it a few times. Does that answer what you asked?
also to for this. Yeah, it does. And I mean, I think it goes back to, a lot of children naturally have kind of, a reaction to the meat industry of like, what do you mean I'm eating a cow? I thought cows were my friends. What do you mean we're doing this? And so there's this fascinating navigating of that where we have to teach them carnism, right? That it's absolutely totally okay to do this in this instance and try in this instance. And I think it's interesting how that sort of works out with the extent to which we as adults all create bubbles for ourselves around certain industries to keep ourselves protected from it. So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we started asking parents about their broader relationship to animals in relation to their diets, in relation to their food, to understand kind of how their own relationship to animals and the structures kind of affect their parenting. And so, yeah, I think really amazing question. Thank you. I guess.
I think that we have 2 questions in the audience. Ken, what is your question?
Hi, Anna and Antonella. I think that was a wonderful presentation. Very good topic. And it makes me reflect a little bit. I was at a national animal welfare conference earlier this year, and some of the questions that were asked are, what are the biggest problems in the animal welfare issues and stuff? And one of the connections that was made was the varying attitude towards different species of animals. So when you reflect on the innocence bubble, with children and families, and where I'm in Canada, it's very similar to that concept. But I see that also in adults and in professions. For example, in the veterinary industry, you can talk to so many veterinarians that have adults that just come and drop their pet off to be euthanized and don't even go in the room and aren't there and present, where you would never see that in a human context. And also in animal protection, you'll have situations where there's domestic disputes and stuff, and the police will come, and there'll be children and family members involved, and they don't even consider the animals that live in the house. There could be 2 cats and a dog that live there as well, and you're going in, you're so considerate of the welfare of the children. So I'm just wondering how you can take this sort of study and put it to, applying it to recognizing that more and more for animal protection workers and for, police officers responding to that.
Yeah, it's a really good. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I know Antonella has, I'll go after you. Do you want to go first?
No, go ahead. Sure.
Okay. I think that's really, really important question. I mean, one thing that makes me think is that what we hear in our studies and in lots of other studies, that this notion that they're family members, that animals are family members. I mean, when push comes to shove, they're often still tools, and that they're not treated as such. Right. And so I think that's like a really important distinction. And I think this kind of work and does have the opportunity to understand how these attitudes are socialized in early life, right? Like if we're understanding how parents are navigating the environments with their children and animals, and given children are picking up all of these attitudes early on in life, like with Antonella the parents are talking in front of their kids, calling their chicken the thing, right? Whereas the dog is the sibling. And they're making these distinctions very clearly, right, from the child, and children are picking up, right, what are the trends are, how should we treat this animal versus this animal. And so I think this can inform the issues that you're talking about. There's also really, I can plop an article in the chat. There's this really extensive review on animals and humans from the psychological lens, and in this article they review literature that talks about correlations between different psychological factors and like animal abuse. And so if kids grow up in a home where their parents are abusing animals, they're more likely to not only abuse animals, but they're also likely to abuse other people. And so there's also like a larger context of like neglect and abuse that could sort of speak to where kids are picking this up from. I don't know if that answered your question.
Are you ready for another question, or did you want to add to that at all? Next question. Okay. So Stephen, what is your question?
Hi, Yana and Antonella. My question is, I noticed in your methodology, you interviewed children from 3 to 7. Is there a reason why you didn't interview children older than 7?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are several reasons. One of the most sort of key ones was that we are trying to we wanted to understand what it means for parents to socialize children at a time when we think that they're kind of they're most likely to be seen as innocent, because they're also like, 3 was the youngest we would go, and 3 was quite young. We do have a few 3-year-olds in the study, and they look a little different than 4 to 5 in terms of the conversations parents are having. So we wanted to see like when cognitive abilities are coming online. So kids are verbal, kids are able to kind of take the stance of the other, develop theory of mind. They're also, their worlds are rapidly expanding as they're entering institutions like center-based care, schools, and their agency is growing and growing. And as they're kind of moving through spaces and their worlds are expanding, parents are then kind of aligning with how they are regulating what children are exposed to and what they respond to. And we thought that that would be a good time window to kind of examine these emergent phenomena. Yeah, because they're like, especially 4 or 5-year-olds, that's they're talkative, and they begin to ask questions. They have emergent concepts of, permanence and death. And so it seemed like an apropos developmentally time to kind of try to see what's happening.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, but I do know one of the reasons that Yana and Antonella were excited to present in this colloquium is because, as most people in this audience know, the field of human animal studies is small, and we're often in silos and not around a lot of other human animal studies scholars. So they were looking for any suggestions any of you might have, if you have any insight into work that's being done in human animal studies that would inform their work as they're analyzing their interviews and going into their final interviews. So if any of you have ideas, feel free to chime in now. And also they have their email addresses up. And so you should, email them if you have any ideas about anything else. We're almost out of time. So Yana and Antonella, is there any last things you'd like to say to the audience about this project or in general before we begin the wrap up today?
Yana, it's you.
I guess, we're still collecting data. We're really, it's a very humbling process, because I think this project, for me personally, it really expanded my relationship to animals in this way, because I'm really, it started out because I was always interested in children and how children navigate things and their families, and it came up kind of organically. I love animals in my life, but it came up in my research because parents just kept talking about how important their pets are and what the animals in their lives are. And so I have a lot to learn. And these data are really exciting to me, because I feel like I'm just learning a whole new way of seeing what children's ecologies look like, and who's important to consider in those ecologies. I know, Antonella, if you have.
Yeah. So just a little bit of background on me. Forgive the term. I hate the term. I've worked as a dog trainer. I'm really a people trainer for 20 years. And doing this work and interviewing people has expanded the amount of information that people are willing to give and about other species, instead of like a sort of, I'm going to complain about my dog or the undesired behavior. Now I get to dig in about other species and how I run my household, and it's super insightful. And I think that just like Yana, like I'm learning a lot. I'm learning about different layers that are there that which weren't acknowledged before. For example, in my experience with talking to people about companion animals, this is not just about companion animals, it's their views on all sorts of animals. And it seems to be very flexible. And however they decide to, whatever role they decide to assign the animal seems culturally acceptable for this sample from the US population that we have. So just, I'm super interested to see where it goes.
Thank you both. Oh, that's weird. Does that sound normal for you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, just on a personal level, I am fascinated by this research as a human animal studies scholar, an animal lover, and a parent of a preschooler and a toddler. Every time I hear you talk about your research, my mind is just like shooting off in fireworks. And I think that as with a society that values non-human animals, well, we value some non-human animals, right? And we value childhood. I think that this is such an important and interesting topic to be studying. I've had the privilege of sitting in on some of your research meetings to see how they go. And just the amount of stuff that comes out in these interviews is amazing. And it's going to be a hard job for you to untangle it all. And I'm really excited for when you get a paper out, and we'll be sure to announce it when you start having your findings. To everyone in the audience, thank you so much for coming today. Our next talk in January, we haven't solidified the date and the time, but I have some information on it there in the chat, and hopefully you are on our mailing list and we will let you know about that. I'll be sending out a recording to everyone who registered for this within the next week or so. And I hope that everybody has a happy holiday season. And for those of you who are academics, enjoy the time off. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.